All right, awesome. So we'll begin. If you can please briefly introduce yourself, if you want to mention your preferred name, pronouns, and what inspired you to begin your journey with reproductive psychiatry.
Well, again, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Dr. Lucy Hutner. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a reproductive psychiatrist. And what that means is that I really, really care for people who is sort of with the intersection between the reproductive lifespan and mental health. And most of the time, that means I care for women in the preconception, pregnancy, and postpartum phases. I also do a lot of work with PMS, PMDD. Also, right, that the definition of women is of course we understand is fluid, and there are all sorts of issues that come up with transgender individuals and in the LGBTQ population where this is also relevant.
Mhm. That's so awesome. So would you mind like mentioning how you got into this work? When I heard that this was kind of the field you were in, I was like, oh, this is so awesome. Like, I just want to
Oh,
hear more and know more.
oh, thank you. It's been a fascinating journey uh, because I feel to some extent my own journey has actually mirrored several other bigger um, bigger facets of our world. The first is how women's mental health fits into the world of medicine, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But then
Mhm,
also how women's mental health has really evolved over time and what that means for women in our world today.
mhm,
So what I would say is that I really thought I was going to become an OB-GYN. When I was in medical school, I was like, I like doing things with my hands. I like solving problems. I'm a very practical person. And I really love delivering babies. I thought that everything to do with OB-GYN was fantastic. Um, and, but what I realized over time when I was doing advanced rotations in OB was that what women and their loved ones were going through at these important times of their lives, these really transformational times of their lives,
mhm,
those stories and those narratives were far more interesting to me. And so I decided to somewhat ambivalently become a psychiatrist. And the only reason why I say that is because at the time there was actually no women's mental health at all. So it was a little bit of a leap of faith. Like, I guess I should become a psychiatrist. um, and and there was a little tiny bit of reproductive psychiatry. In fact, one of the homes or the pioneers of reproductive psychiatry was where I trained at Mass General. So they were wonderful.
mhm,
But a fair amount of the time, I would get feedback that said, oh, what are you interested in? Supervisors would say that, mentors would say that,
mhm,
fellowship directors would say that, like, what kind of career are you planning on pursuing? And I said, well, I'm not really sure, but what interests me the most are parent and infant interactions, women's mental health, the how we interface with obstetric and reproductive issues. And bottom line, on more than one occasion, I was actually told, um, you can't do that. What you're talking about as a field does
mhm.
not exist.
Hmm.
And and I was also told a couple of times, we don't do that here, and there is nobody who can help you in this journey. So now I'm the type of person, and I honestly think a lot of people in reproductive psychiatry are the type of people that if you tell me that, watch out, because that's going to be the reason I'm going to do it, right? Like if
Yeah,
you
it just
tell me
like
I
gives
can't,
you that motivation.
exactly. I'm like, if you tell me I can't do something, now I'm definitely going to do it, right?
Yeah.
So, um, and it also just seems so logical. Like,
Mhm,
so for example, depression is the most common complication of childbirth,
Mhm.
way more than we possibly not have a field in it. So um, I got really lucky. I was at Columbia at the time, and Columbia just said, "Hey, do you guys do a few of you want to just start a reproductive psychiatry program?" And we were like,
Yeah,
"Sure."
that
And
sounds great.
yeah, and so it was super fun. I did that for almost 8 years
Mhm.
and got really interested in this area in terms of both the content, but also in education.
Yeah.
Um, but again, all along the way, for example, this fall, we just
Mhm.
launched the very first standardized curriculum in reproductive psychiatry because
That's
there
so
is
awesome.
none.
Mhm.
And then actually, we just handed in the first version of the very first textbook in reproductive psychiatry that's going to be published in 2021 by the American Psychiatric Association. But for example, when we pitched this idea, like we created this curriculum, there were 5 of us who really wanted to do this textbook, and we called the American Psychiatric Association publishing group, and we're like, "Hey, we don't think you guys have a textbook in this area. Do you want to do it?" And they
Mhm.
said, but it was funny because the APA then called us back, and they were like, "Oh yeah, so we looked at our holdings, and in fact, you're right. We don't have a reproductive psychiatry textbook. And actually, we haven't published anything in this area in 35 years." And we're like,
Wow.
right. And so this is
Wow.
what, isn't it crazy? And so this is what
Mhm.
I mean about sort of having it's a fascinating experience because
Yeah.
as we do this work, there's like a mirror held up to
Mhm.
this area and how it relates to the rest of medicine. The fact,
Yeah.
and it's interesting, it doesn't even actually occupy a low place within medicine, actually is not in it, right? That we have
Mhm.
placed it in there. And then the second is like, I mean, it's actually been super gratifying because I think in the last 10 years or so, there's just been a huge more emphasis on mental health, especially women's mental health in our larger society. So that's
Yeah.
been great too. It's been wonderful to watch this field explode, but it's been wonderful to like have this, like, I don't think anyone now would go through what we went through, 10 years ago, even. So
Yeah.
that's how I sort
No,
of got.
that's yeah, that's amazing that the work that you and your colleagues have been doing to really kind of like spearhead not only just like in the reproductive space, but with menstruation and academics in your own field, really working on publishing textbooks to curriculums. Like it's amazing. I applaud you all.
Well, thank you. No, and I think the reason why it's really relevant
Hmm.
to the idea of menstruation is because, of course, that's the very beginning of your
Hmm.
reproductive life cycle. It's like
Yeah.
the first signature event. And when we promote the dignity of menstruation, that means we're promoting the dignity of women everywhere.
Hmm.
When we promote access for menstruation, that means we're promoting the idea that women are allowed to take up space
Yeah.
and own the space.
Hmm.
When we promote dignity and equality and equity with menstruation, we're saying that number one, women matter. We're saying that number two, anyone who menstruates matters. Number three, that it's also menstruation is fascinating because I think in some ways there's a focus on, okay, it's a bloody event. Yes, there is the actual menstrual, actual menstruation.
Yeah.
But when we think about it symbolically, right,
Hmm.
it's like it is a tremendously empowering event
Hmm.
because it is basically saying my body can, if I so choose to, create a new life.
Yeah.
And it's really, really empowering. And I think it starts with the idea of dignity, access, and just getting the word out. So this is why I'm so glad that you guys are doing this stuff. I think it's fantastic.
Well, awesome. We are glad to have you here on this journey with us, and to see all the work that you continue to do on your own, as well. So I did have a question. Just you had mentioned that that psychiatric like disorders and whether that's like depression can be more complex during like reproductive years. So can you kind of explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, yes. Um, I wish I could explain it as though it weren't more complicated because it makes it almost seem as though, right, that like, reproductive issues are a one-off, right? That where this is
Yeah.
sort of, there's a way that um, part of what I'm still disturbed by is there's still an otherization of women's
Mm.
issues that, you know, to me, this is like this should be what we all learn about and what we all discuss,
Yeah.
um, but uh, um, it right, and it almost makes it seem as though the default setting is not to have this interaction,
Hmm.
right? So even the idea of this is a confusing one, but what I would say is that we know for sure
Hmm.
that mood, anxiety, and reproductive mental health and reproduction are intricately linked. Um, it makes it challenging for a number of different reasons. The biggest challenge, I would say, is from a diagnostic standpoint because
Hmm.
um, and I'm about to say something that I think that like the vast majority of my colleagues would agree with. Um,
Hmm.
it is really rare for me to ever have a PMS or a PMDD consultation where the person
Hmm.
actually only has that. Um,
Okay.
The vast majority of the time I have seen these patients, maybe it's just because maybe the more complicated ones are coming my way, but
Hmm.
the vast majority of the time there is an undiagnosed mood disorder there, often in a bipolar spectrum, but often sometimes just plain old depression,
Hmm.
where I feel like I'm in the position quite a bit of the time to be like, I know you're here to talk about PMS, but
Yeah, but
if we actually look from a psychiatric point of view, there's something here that usually the menstrual cycle is exacerbating whatever is underlying there
Mhm.
anyway. But um, every once in a while, I have a like very isolated situation where it's sort of just PMS or PMDD, but rare. It
Yeah.
is most of the time that there is something that has not been fully acknowledged, treated, diagnosed, and then
Mhm.
I'm sort of breaking this news like, oh, by the way, blah blah. Now, in some ways, that makes it great, right? That it's a way of
Mhm.
solving a problem that has been vexing that person for a long time, but it's also just, I feel like a little bit like the bearer of bad news at times.
Yeah.
Um, the other way that it can be a little bit um, complicated has to do, there's one other way, which is it has to do with the fact that there are many things within someone's reproductive lifespan that
Mhm.
can be inherently impactful of one's mental health.
Mhm.
Pregnancy loss, miscarriage, sexual
Yeah.
assault, a traumatic delivery, God forbid, stillbirth. Um, I'm not putting voluntary termination of pregnancy in there because that is not considered a trauma.
Mhm.
Um, but there are a number of things that occur within the reproductive sphere that
Yeah.
that that then someone will form a sort of reactive anxiety,
Mhm.
depression, right? And then
Yeah.
some of the difficulty comes from like let's just let this person be a normal person. They're grieving and let's just support
Yeah.
them grieving, right? Like that we don't want to necessarily pathologize everything at all. But at the
Mhm.
same time, I've treated many women, for example, who have had a number of miscarriages and they obviously have PTSD or something like that.
Yeah.
And it is stemming from issues in their reproductive lifespan. But then secondarily, they they develop a mental health condition. So that can also occur quite a lot. And
Mhm.
those two reasons, I think, are the reasons why it's a little bit complicated. You're
Okay.
sort of like
Yeah.
constantly trying to balance, like, what is chicken? What is
Mhm.
egg? What is more important, right? What is normal? What is not normal, right? So, right, it can be
Yeah.
a little bit challenging.
Definitely. Kind of like that dual diagnosis, trying to balance which one to like work on first or like what's exacerbating the other one.
100%. And
Mhm.
the third thing I would say too is, and I think that this is something that is still very much not well understood and not vocalized as much, is
Mhm.
how to support people going through something where enormous amount of resilience is required,
Yeah.
or right, how to really encourage that degree of resilience, right? Like a lot of times we'll talk about all these things that are difficult and how they impact
Mhm.
people, but I mean, one of the reasons why I love what I do is my patients are so brave. I mean,
Mhm.
they are so brave. It is extraordinary. The amount of coping resiliency that I've seen is, it's like, I know that, our world is like falling apart and everything is horrible, but I will say that I feel really lucky because every day I get to talk to people
Mhm.
who are some of the bravest people I've ever known.
Yeah.
So
No, I love that. That's part of the reason why I am also very hands-on, like love working with people for that exact reason, having those like more intimate connections and seeing like that growth that they can achieve. It's amazing.
it's really incredible. Um,
Mhm.
So, for example, this morning I was just talking with one of my newer patients. I've only spoken to her
Mhm.
a couple of times, but this is someone who has had multiple pregnancy losses and then had a stillbirth, which was incredibly traumatic.
Mhm.
And she came to me again because she's now pregnant again. And this pregnant
Mhm.
this pregnancy appears to be keeping. It seems to be healthy, blah blah. But as you can
Yeah.
imagine, every time she goes to the OB, she has a panic attack. Every time
Yeah.
she has an ultrasound, she has a trigger of PTSD. I mean, it is just, and the act of just trying to move on and get pregnant again is
Yeah.
an act of enormous resilience. So, and then the same thing is true again, even with everything that you guys are doing with menstruation, like trying to pull it out of the shadows,
Mhm.
trying to make this like, hey, we're healthy human beings. And by the way, this is an awesome superpower that many of us have. And
Yep.
let's love it, right? As opposed to like, it's bad and
Yeah.
everything's terrible, right? So,
Yeah. No, that's a perfect segue to my next question that I had was just like as you know, as most of us know, there is a huge stigma surrounding both mental health and menstrual health. And so, how have you kind of been able through your work to kind of see that stigma with both of those topics? And do you feel that the stigma may have been exacerbated by either issue at all? If someone has a stigma about mental health, does that impact their like reproductive menstrual health or like vice versa?
yes. I was so happy to see that question when you sent that to me earlier because I do think that stigma plays an enormous role in both of those issues.
Mhm.
And it's unnecessary, but it's there. Um, so, for example, now again, I feel a little bad. I'm giving a lot of sort of preconception pregnancy examples, as you can see, but
No, go for it.
um, this is not the only time this has happened, but at all. But I've had a number of patients who have come to me about 2 years after they gave birth
Mhm.
and said, I'm terrified to become pregnant again. I'm thinking about having another child. And I'm terrified because I'm quite sure I had postpartum psychosis, or I had terrible OCD and I had no idea it was going to be that bad. And the stigma kept them from getting any care at all. And they will sometimes see
Yeah.
me like 2 years later and they'll say,
Mm.
I didn't want to be that person. I thought, some people will say, I thought that, Child Protective Service is going to come and take my baby away.
Yeah.
That, I thought I was losing my mind and having a nervous breakdown. I didn't want to tell anybody how bad it was. I see this all the time. And it is painful when I see
Yeah.
situations like that because number one, the person's been suffering unnecessarily long because all of these things are treatable.
Yeah.
Number two, they've been suffering alone. And then and with this like terrible secret that they feel like they have to hide. And then the
Mhm.
third is that they can't, even enjoy any elements of becoming a mother because all you're worried about is like, oh my God, I'm having a nervous breakdown and I can't tell
Yeah.
anybody, and I'm losing my mind. I'm severely mentally ill. I can't say anything.
Yeah.
But the third, and the last point is that then they have like a sort of post-traumatic reaction where they're like, I've had a number of patients who are like, I'm never getting pregnant again. I might want a second child, but I can't go through that again.
Yeah.
And their avoidance of what what they imagine is going to be the suffering again will have a tremendous impact on them. And that's
Yeah.
just one example of the stigma. There is a horrendous stigma against taking medications in pregnancy that is so unnecessary.
Mhm.
Frankly, there's a lot of stigmas here because there's another stigma about women who elect not to breastfeed. Boy, is that group stigmatized.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot. And the way that I think it impacts menstrual health is sort of why I think menstruation itself is stigmatized.
Mhm.
I will tell you right now, I never wanted to go into politics. I never wanted to go into law. I never wanted to go into social work. I never wanted to go into something that seems societally based. I always was like, I'm a science person. Like, I'm going to go into medical school. Like,
Yeah.
that was just who I was. Like, I was never part of like the Senate, whatever. Like, I never did those things.
Yeah.
And it was only when I became a reproductive psychiatrist
Mhm.
that you realize the societal impact and how that affects our health and our mental health. The lack of maternity leave in our country is a disgusting abomination, and it is so unhealthy, it should be illegal. But the same thing is true with anything related to menstruation. And I think that the problem is it there are a great deal of underlying narratives. Women's voices don't matter.
Yeah.
Women's bodies don't matter. Women's experiences don't matter. They have to borrow the space, they can't own the space.
Yeah.
Their power doesn't matter. To the extent that they'll be idealized at times, okay, if you're going to be idealized, then you have to be a perfect mother who also works 50 hours a week, who also breastfeeds and pumps, and
Mhm.
who never complains. And you have to lose all the baby weight. And if you menstruate, then you better shut up about it and never talk about it. Right. So there's like a
Yep.
kind of weird, in my mind, very rigid idealization of what
Yeah.
femininity and women are supposed to represent. And then everything else is intensely devalued and
Oh, yeah.
stigmatized. There's a huge split. And what happens is a lot of these ideas, a lot of these narratives get played out all the time.
Mhm.
Uh, there there's I mean just like totally blast things here, but um The World Health Organization said about
Hmm.
doing what's called a baby-friendly initiative, which is supposed to promote breastfeeding in hospitals. Great,
Hmm.
wonderful. Hospitals get extra points for doing X, Y, and Z to promote breastfeeding.
Yeah.
Wonderful. But why isn't it called the Mother and Baby Friendly Initiative?
Hmm.
Why isn't it called the Family Friendly Initiative? Why isn't it called the Parent Infant Initiative?
Yep.
The actual woman and the parent are erased.
Hmm.
They want to promote breastfeeding, but they're not going to take into account or even name the experience of the person feeding. I
Yep.
mean, it's really extraordinary. The amount of erasure that goes on is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And it's not like necessarily they're like, let's just ignore it deliberately. It's more like, oh, did anyone think about this? Oh no, we didn't even consider it, right? It's
Yeah.
sort of like, right, it's so implicit. It's so implicit that,
Yeah.
that I was like, baby friendly initiative, what, but
Like, but
uh, those
we're
babies aren't
missing
like on
something.
their own, like they're not just like lying around on their own. There's a diet.
Yeah.
There's a dyad and there's an actual other person on the
Mhm.
end of that dyad. And if you don't even name them, they're not taking up any space in your mind. And that's a serious
Yep.
problem. And
Yeah.
again, I think that that is 100% what relates to stigma.
Definitely, I feel like a huge issue with not only like breastfeeding, but giving birth in general, or like the option to give birth or not. People are always focused on the child, and like, yes, it is so important. But as you said, there's that other entity, that other parent, that other mother, that their rights and experiences also deserve to be recognized.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm having a little trouble hearing you, but I think what you just said is that there's another parent that deserves to be recognized.
Mhm.
Yes, 100%. So there was an article
Mhm.
that came out in in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, that basically said outright that the rates of postpartum depression are as high in new fathers as they are in new mothers. Um,
Mhm.
there's another whole, there's some early work. Basically, there's no work in LGBT families, which is ridiculous, but
Yep.
there's some early work looking at the experiences of being the non-birth mother. Um,
Mhm.
right. So looking at the mother, another
Yeah.
mother who's there, they are another parent, and yet they haven't given birth, and sort of thinking about what their experiences are like. What about the experiences of gay men becoming parents? Um, this is also why I think some of the breastfeeding issue, I think, right, it's like, but there are lots of amazing parents who don't have
Mhm.
anything to do with
We don't.
breastfeeding.
Yeah. Yep.
Adoptive parents, they're not breastfeeding for the most part, like it just doesn't,
Mhm.
it just doesn't, you start to hear these implicit narratives that are all over
Mhm.
the place about what women should be, and they're actually not logical,
Yeah.
but that's a perfect example where the other person, the partner, if the person has one, they're
Mhm.
just, it's like as though they don't exist at all.
Yeah.
There is very little research into this area. When you look up research on like men's experiences of their partners giving birth or LGBT families, it's scarce. All the
Mhm.
articles basically say, this is scarce, this is scarce, this is scarce, like
Yep.
there's known about it, even though like building a family is the most amazing thing, if people wish to do that, it's typically one of the most transformative events of their lives. So,
Yeah.
and I think that it's really true when it comes to menstruation, in the sense of, if we look at the menstrual cycle,
Mhm.
it's it's really interesting because, for example, like early in our lives, many women are attempting to avoid pregnancy if they can, right?
Mhm.
And so the idea is like, let's just prevent this from happening, right? Then they come to me for a preconception evaluation, and
Mhm.
I would say 85 to 90% of my patients
Mhm.
have no idea how the menstrual cycle actually works to achieve a pregnancy.
Yeah.
Zero. And I would say that I was not taught that in medical school at all. You're
Mhm.
taught about like
Wow.
the menstrual cycle and hormones and all of that, but you're not
Yeah.
taught about like what the menstrual cycle is all about, that there's like
Mhm.
a small fertile window and that there's like things that you get pregnant, like how it
Yeah.
really works, right? And so, um, yeah,
Fascinating.
yeah, it's really fascinating. There's like
Yeah.
no end to the questions that need to be answered, but
No.
it's fascinating.
I love
And
that.
one quick thing I would say too is that
Mhm.
we don't, I think that the idea about stigma and menstruation in particular is when you're talking about younger women,
Mhm.
you're talking about women who really need support
Yeah.
because these are women who are at really significant risk of sexual assault.
Mhm.
They are just trying to find themselves. They are trying to figure out who they are, and they're doing so already embedded within a certain type of social context. And that social context can be really intense at times. So um, I think, plus all the body image issues, of course. So,
Mhm.
um, and eating disorders, etc. So,
Yeah.
um, it it is super important. This is why, like, we feel very strongly as reproductive psychiatrists that we
Mhm.
care for people all the way through the reproductive lifespan because it's
Yeah.
those issues affect people no matter how old they are.
No matter what age range they're in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in your opinion, like where does menstrual equity and mental health fit into like this growing social justice movement in the United States, or like why do you feel it's important to like include them both?
Um, what I would say, and I'll preface the statement by saying, I'm a doctor and there are definitely people who can speak to social justice much better than me. So I am very humble in this regard.
Mhm.
I'm a science nerd, but um, but what I would say is I would say threefold. Um, Number one, because women and anyone who identifies as a woman don't just need a seat at the table, they need to be woven into the fabric of social justice.
Mhm.
Number two, and I think is honestly probably the most important thing out of the three pieces of this answer,
Yeah.
um, uh, the intersectionality between race and gender
Mhm.
is uh, there are no words for how painful of an impact that has when it comes to reproductive mental health and reproductive health.
Yeah.
Um, Black women's mortality in childbirth is unforgivably high.
Mhm.
Um, and I was actually just writing about this piece for the textbook. You know, why? Okay, some of that has to do with access to quality healthcare. Some of it has to do with higher rates of preeclampsia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
But when there have been a number of articles that have come out that it's like, oh gee, why don't we actually ask Black women how they feel about the healthcare? Like amazing idea. Why don't we actually ask people's opinions?
Yeah.
And a number of focus groups have said, I don't feel of Black women have said, I don't feel comfortable going to my OB because I
Mhm.
know that they don't perceive me as good enough.
Yep.
I get the idea that they have implicit bias against me. I get the idea that there's systemic racism in the healthcare system, and
Mhm.
I don't feel valued. And if
Yeah.
I felt valued and if it was less systemic racism, then I would probably go more.
Yeah.
Um, then it was fascinating too, because there was a number of follow-up studies looking at like whether it's actually true if there's implicit bias in healthcare, and there absolutely is. There's a number of systematic reviews and meta-analyses that show that just like other human beings, doctors
Mhm.
also have implicit bias, and
Yeah.
that we must have anti-racism training.
Yeah.
So what we want to do actually, so the second part of the curriculum that we just published,
Mhm.
we're now collaborating with OBs to create like an OB version of mental health curriculum, right? Like, and these OBs are so funny because
Yeah.
they're like, can't we just fit all of psychiatry on one like tiny little index card? It's like, just give
Like
me 5 bullet points, right? They're so like practical. It's like, oh, well, we just wrote like an 1,000-page textbook on that, but yeah, I can give you an index card,
Yeah,
right?
I
Like,
guess.
right. They're like, yeah, just give me 5 bullet points. That's all I want. They are so practical, but what we're going to do actually with this is that we are actually taking the opportunity to create an embedded anti-racism component to the curriculum, and we're going to test it
Mhm.
pre-test, post-test, etc.,
Awesome.
so that we just embed it within our
Yeah.
education, because that's what should be done anyway. But
Mhm.
that whole issue, I think, it is shocking. And
Yeah.
I've had a number of patients who are Black in particular, of a number of other patients who are people of color in other ways, but Black women in particular. And they are terrified to give birth. They're terrified. They
Yeah.
will say to me, I am terrified that I'm going to enter the hospital and not leave.
Yeah. And that's like a valid concern. That's
And
the
they should
craziest
be
part.
terrified, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and if it can happen to Serena Williams, it can happen to anyone.
Mhm.
I mean, she really almost died. That was a terrifying story. And
Yeah.
so this is a huge issue. And then the last is the way it fits into social justice is just about the larger idea that now this gets into issues around economies and other things, but women's mental health is all about connection.
Mhm.
You just can't have predatory capitalism that destroys people's lives, no robust healthcare system that leaves people out in the cold and bankrupt within the sphere of women's mental health.
Yeah.
Because women's mental health is all about connection. It's all about attachment, and it's all about seeing other people and connecting to other people. So it just by nature has a social justice element to it, because it goes against the idea that we're all on our own and we should all just be able to be successful by some,
Yeah.
you know, some predetermined parameters.
Mhm.
So there's that too.
Yeah, I think it's definitely very important to kind of integrate social justice and medical academic fields, because I know I kind of experienced that going through school, that my major was public health. So some of our classes were
Yeah.
very science lab focused, but then we also did a lot of community work and looking at community based approaches. And like that the fact that that isn't the norm is astounding to me. Like those should not be separate concepts of like science and social justice. Like they can interact together and
A
should
hundred
interact
percent.
together.
I couldn't agree with you more that
Mhm.
it should be embedded, it should be expanded upon.
Mm.
I will say that I think my colleagues in the rest of medicine, we're very pro this. Uh, New England Journal of Medicine, other places have basically just come out and said, we are part of systemic racism, so we need to
Yeah.
fix this, right? There's actually like a lot of movement. There's not, I haven't heard basically any resistance to that idea at all.
Mhm.
But it is a change, and it just shows us, how that's another example of sort of, oh, it just
Yeah.
didn't come up, right?
It's just yeah.
Just didn't come up. Yeah. Right. The experiences that most people have. Oh, amazing. Just didn't come up. It's
Crazy how that happens.
yeah, it's amazing.
Um, so what role do you feel that the youth play or can have a bigger part in combating stigma associated with both of these issues of mental and menstrual health?
Yeah. Um, I would say, 3 things. I would say, that and now I will say this as, like, a total lame Gen Xer. So, I am right in the middle of Gen X, like, when, Eddie Van Halen died, and I was like, "Oh my god, I remember him!" Right? Like, I'm old, okay? So I will say this, like, the youth of today, um, you youths
Mhm.
are so good at the social media stuff. One thing I will say though, I mean, really like, it's extraordinary how fast social change can occur. Um, Especially I think through obviously the non-toxic and non-damaging destroying or the non democracy destroying aspects of social media. I think that there's like, a real way that actually some of these movements took on a lot more velocity than they otherwise would have.
Mhm.
So for example, transgender rights. Um, when I was young, I can tell you right now, that was, I mean, talk about stigma. Oh my God,
Mhm.
the rate of suicide in that population, enormous. Um, uh, I remember even when I was in medical school, one of my colleagues came out as transgender, and that was like a, it was sort of like, are they going to be okay? And, and
Yeah.
that wasn't that long ago.
Mhm.
And the transformation that has taken place in terms of a true examination, not just of supporting transgender individuals, which of course we should, as well
Mhm.
as gender fluid individuals,
Yeah.
but also the idea of just examining sex and gender generally is a really important idea, and taking a brand new lens onto that. And that's an area where I think social media actually can be really, really, really impactful. I think the second area is that I do think that, and I am not an expert at all in LGBTQ rights. Other people can speak much more cogently about that than I can, but I will say that there does tend to be a bit of a generational, like, shift.
Yeah.
And there's a level to which those issues in a younger population are so much more accepted and so much more just like, yeah, whatever, than it was even when I was growing up. And people who are 25 years older than me, boy,
Mhm.
was that it was like
Yeah.
legal to even mention that you were gay. So that's another issue that I think that youth can really lead on, that intersects with reproductive mental health. And then I think is the last one is the issue of race.
Mhm.
That you know, you know, I think this summer showed our country everything we need to know about just how deep the
Mhm.
cracks are in the foundation, and just how systemic the racism it is, and just how violent it is. And
Yeah.
so I think we have an enormous amount of work to do. Um,
Mhm.
but I think that people in the younger generation have like the power to, and the energy and the drive to fix some of those cracks in the foundation.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely echo all of what
Mhm.
you've said about being sure to like include those more marginalized populations within both mental and menstrual health. People who aren't who are part of the LGBTQ community or who are specifically like Black or Latinx or another like multicultural race. Very important
Yeah,
to continue highlighting their role and their experiences in both of these movements.
yeah, agreed.
So, how has your work as a reproductive psychiatrist kind of changed during the COVID pandemic? Have you like learned anything that you will bring to future that like it's not just done and over with once this is kind of that you
Yeah,
kind of want to
yeah.
keep going with?
I would say probably a few things about that. The first was more of an observation,
Mhm.
which was, during the earlier days of the pandemic. I think that hospitals now are like, now they feel, and I've talked to my colleagues at Columbia, et cetera, like now I think they feel a lot more like, okay, now I'm down with it. I know, like, when someone comes in to give birth, I know how to do it. But in the
Mhm.
early days of the pandemic, obviously, uh, hospitals were
Mm,
trying to do the right thing. They had they were well intentioned, but um, I was personally caring for some of those people who were staring down the barrel of giving birth alone. Um,
yeah.
and there's a good reason why the World Health Organization says that women should not give birth alone. Um, there's a really good reason for that. And the terror and the heartbreak that these women had about that
Yeah.
was really striking. That it wasn't an anxious response, it wasn't an angry response, it was a terrified and heartbroken response. And I think that's the
Yeah.
only right response to have, because
Yeah.
this is one of the most deeply transformative moments of your life, and you need the support, and it's all about connection. And so most reasonable people, when they say, should I give birth in a hospital by myself? Yeah, the answer is no, thank you.
Answer
Like,
is no thanks, no.
oh yeah, that's not something I'm going to be doing anytime soon. Right? There's a reason
Yeah.
why it's not recommended to do that. So
Mhm.
that was really, really salient during that time. And if
Yeah.
anything, it just once again brought to the fore that connection is crucially important, and that we all need that level of support. Now, we all knew that, the postpartum period is one where we need a great deal more support anyway. But boy, did COVID bring that home. Uh,
Yeah.
I think the second thing was a bit like unexpected, which was, so I basically just transferred my entire practice to all remote, and I don't have an office right now. Like, I literally don't. I'm in my bedroom. I I don't think I'm ever going to go back to the office. I mean, that was another sort of minor surprising thing. I actually may like start to form a like women's mental health like digital practice group, so that we can give like
Yeah.
group supervision and stuff, because I have some colleagues in like San Diego, Los Angeles, Austin. And like
Mhm.
I think it's great, because if you have the issue of access is incredibly important in reproductive mental health. And
Yeah.
that outside of a few cities, like, we all know each other. There are only probably, I don't know, I think less than 100 reproductive psychiatrists altogether. Like, we're a tiny field, and I may be wrong about that number, but something really small. And
Yeah.
if we were able to increase access through digital mental health, I think that's awesome. Um,
Yeah.
so COVID actually really, really, really taught me the benefit of doing this. And I think it also led to a certain amount of acceptability and feasibility, like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All my
Still
patients were like,
working.
yeah, it's so much more convenient. I don't have to like go to your office. Sure. Yeah, they didn't mind. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's awesome. I love that's what I know that's something I work in city schools at a high school, and that has been a huge thing of students like I don't have to drive 30 minutes to get to school now, and they have that extra time to be even dedicating to work and working on other things that they need to be doing. So
Yeah. And
definitely
the one
awesome.
thing I would say too is that, one piece of reproductive mental health and women's mental health is also trying to figure out work-life balance, and trying to set
Mhm.
boundaries, and trying to figure out how to have a family, and et cetera, et cetera. And I will say that I think a lot of people, myself included, have felt kind of like, oh, I don't have to like commute an hour every day, which actually is exhausting and takes up a lot of time. And like, uh, there are some real benefits in my mind for, like, there are these interesting articles out there saying that women's careers are taking a hit, which they probably are. I think though it probably depends on the field, because if there are fields that can be done remotely, there are some significant advantages, including the ability to be home. So anyway, just something to think about.
No, definitely field specific, very much so on the seeing more growth due to like being home and more remote, or maybe not as much as they had before. So I
Exactly,
appreciate
exactly.
your input and view on that. And then lastly, I would love for you to share a call to action that you for viewers to take on in this next year.
Um, now, um, forgive me because like when someone says a call to action, I feel like the only response I have is like a total psychiatrist response, which is like uh, one of my favorite supervisors used to say, like, don't just do something, sit there, right? So like
Mhm.
I'm sort of like, what if we actually reflect instead of taking action? Um,
Yeah.
so I think for me, the biggest call to action would be to um, allow yourself, if you are a woman who is thinking about menstruation, if you're thinking about body image, if you're in the
Mhm.
preconception, pregnancy, postpartum sphere, if you are recovering from a sexual assault, no matter what's going on, I would say the first thing is trusting yourself. And the second is trusting your own internal compass, because and that those two things I would say are the most important call to action in some ways, because a lot of times we're not taught that we're able to do that.
Yes.
And when you follow your own internal compass, you're never wrong.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
No, I love that. It doesn't always have to be a supercharged, let's march down the street, but kind of like listening to yourself and kind of taking that reflection piece to see where you're at or what else you could be doing is definitely important.
100%. I mean, um, I guess the other thing, if I were to say anything in terms of like external actions, is
Mhm.
to perhaps do things that make you feel a little uncomfortable. Um, you know,
Yeah.
uh, I think that the I think the reason why, one of the many reasons besides the horror of it, why the George Floyd thing had such an impact, is because many people witnessed something that Black people know is the truth because they've lived it for
Mhm.
decades.
Yeah.
And white people actually were somewhat forced to see the level of brutality for the first time.
Yeah.
And there it was in literally black and white. And so pushing oneself to remain uncomfortable is very important, because there's a lot of truth in what's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So
It is.
that's what I would say.
I love that. A lot of truth, a lot of room for growth.
Well, there's a lot of people who live in that uncomfortable space every day.
Mhm. Yep. And not even as a choice, but just because of their identities that they have to.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
100%. And that no matter what they do, they will be perceived a certain way.
Yep. Um,
I'll leave with one quick anecdote, which I was so sorry. I could go on about this forever, obviously.
no, I
Um,
love it. You're good.
um, there was a large study out of the American Association of Medical Colleges,
Mhm.
looking at how medical students are evaluated according to various leadership skills. And some of the leadership skills were what we would probably consider like kind of quote unquote masculine leadership skills.
Mhm.
Did this person take control during a code? Do they seem decisive? Are they good decision makers? Can they
Mhm.
act rapidly? Blah, blah, blah. And The most surprising thing that I saw in that data was that only certain people benefited from having those sorts of decisive um, skills.
Yeah.
Uh, the more that white men had those skills, the higher in the class they ended up.
Mhm.
White women also somewhat, but less so. Um, Black women, if they had those types of skills, were actually punished. They ended
Yep.
up lower in the class, and the people who ended up lowest in the class were the Black men. The Black men who were decisive, on point, running a code, i.e., taking power, actually ended up
Mhm.
lowest in the class. So those are the sorts of situations you realize the uncomfortableness of people's lives every day.
Yeah.
And I think making sure that people understand that they need to put themselves in front of uncomfortable situations and witness that is really important.
Yeah. No, definitely. Ugh, I've appreciated our time together so much today.
Oh my
All
God,
of your
it's so nice.
insight.
Oh, it's so nice to talk to you. It's wonderful. I'm so proud of you guys. This is so great.
Yes, so thank you so much for all of your insight today and just general. I think and I know you've inspired me and hopefully others as well who will watch this to take charge and kind of allow yourself to be uncomfortable. You have started your career being uncomfortable and remained in that space, pushing through some of those barriers and paving that way in reproductive psychiatry. So thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime. You guys are doing an amazing job.